The rain began as a soft drizzle, an almost soothing rhythm against the windshield of the old pickup truck. Sam had been driving for hours, cutting through the isolated back roads of a rural stretch he'd never traveled before. His phone had died long ago, and the map he carried felt useless, the road signs blurred by the endless sheets of rain cascading down. He told himself he'd stop at the next sign of life, but that had been over 30 miles ago. As the storm intensified, visibility plummeted. The wipers fought valiantly but were no match for the relentless downpour. When the headlights illuminated a battered wooden sign with the faint words, "Hollow Pines Inn, Vacancy," Sam let out a breath of relief. The inn sat just off the road, barely visible through the storm. It was old, its once white paint chipped and stained with years of neglect, but it was shelter. He pulled into the gravel driveway, tires crunching against the wet stones. The door creaked as he stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The smell of mildew was strong, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. A woman sat behind the counter, her face partially hidden by the brim of a wide hat. She didn't smile, didn't even greet him, just slid the guest book across the counter and tapped her finger on the yellowed pages. Sam signed his name hurriedly, dripping water onto the paper. Without a word, she handed him a rusted key with the number 6 engraved into it. The hallway leading to his room was narrow and eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional. Room 6 was at the end of the hall. The key scraped noisily in the lock, and when he pushed the door open, a faint chill swept over him, though he chalked it up to the damp weather. The room was modest, a small bed with a faded quilt, a wooden chair, and a lamp that cast more shadow than light. But again, it was shelter. The rain outside intensified, turning from a torrential downpour into a full-fledged storm. The sound was deafening, as if the heavens themselves were trying to claw their way inside. Sam closed the curtains, shut off the lamp, and collapsed onto the bed. He just needed a few hours' sleep before continuing his journey. He had barely drifted off when a noise jolted him awake. It wasn't the storm. This sound was closer, inside the inn. A soft but deliberate tapping like knuckles against wood. It was coming from his door. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice groggy but edged with unease. The tapping stopped immediately, replaced by silence so profound it made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, hesitating for a moment before peeking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. He shook his head, convincing himself it was a trick of the storm or his own overactive imagination. But as he turned back toward the bed, he froze. There on the quilt was a single wet handprint. It hadn't been there before. He hadn't touched the bed with wet hands. His stomach churned. The tapping resumed, louder this time, more insistent. He spun around to face the door. "I said, 'Who's there?'" he shouted, his voice cracking. Again, the sound ceased. This time, though, it was followed by something worse, a slow, deliberate creak, as if someone were dragging their fingers along the length of the door. Sam grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon as he approached the door. He swung it open in one swift motion, prepared to confront whoever or whatever was tormenting him. The hallway was empty, yet the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though someone had just been there. He was about to retreat into his room when he noticed something peculiar. The guest book at the front desk was open, the pages fluttering slightly despite the lack of a breeze. Against his better judgment, Sam approached. The entries were sparse, most of them decades old. Then he saw it. His name, scrawled at the bottom of the list. Beneath it, though, was another entry. It hadn't been there when he signed in. Room 6, checked in, Sam. Checked out. The ink trailed off, as if the writer had been interrupted. A cold chill swept over him, and for the first time, Sam noticed the stains on the desk. Dark, rusty smears that looked far too much like blood. He stumbled back, panic clawing at his chest. He had to leave. Grabbing his jacket from the chair, he rushed toward the door, his boots squeaking against the wet floor. But as he reached for the handle, the lights flickered and died. The storm outside howled with renewed ferocity, and the inn was plunged into darkness. Behind him, the tapping began again. Only now, it was on the window. Sam didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to never look back. But something compelled him, an unseen force drawing his gaze toward the sound. He turned, slowly, reluctantly. A face stared back at him through the rain-slicked glass. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Its pale skin glowed faintly in the darkness, its hollow eyes like deep, unending pits. The thing grinned, baring teeth too sharp and too many. It raised one skeletal hand and tapped the glass again, as if taunting him. Sam bolted. He didn't care about the rain, didn't care about his truck or the muddy road. He just ran, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm seemed to chase him, the rain lashing harder with every step. When he finally reached his truck and tore open the door, he dared one last glance at the inn. The lights were back on, glowing warmly in the distance. The front door stood open, and for a brief moment Sam thought he saw the woman from the desk standing there, her wide hat hiding her face. But then the door slammed shut and the inn vanished. The gravel driveway, the battered sign, the entire building, gone. Sam didn't stop driving until the sun rose, the rain finally letting up. When he reached the nearest town, he tried to tell his story, but no one believed him. Hollow Pines Inn had burned down decades ago, they said. It was a tragedy, all the guests trapped inside. But it was just an old ghost story now, nothing more. Sam didn't argue. He simply got back in his truck and drove, vowing never to take the back roads again. But sometimes, on lonely, rain-soaked nights, he swears he hears it still, the soft, insistent tapping coming from somewhere just out of sight. The rain had been relentless all evening, a punishing cascade that turned the narrow mountain road into a slick, treacherous gauntlet. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as the car's tires struggled for purchase. Her GPS had long lost signal, and the only guidance she had now was the faint beams of her headlights slicing through the downpour. She cursed herself for taking the shortcut. Just as she rounded another bend, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. Claire slammed on the brakes, her heart lurching in her chest. The figure didn't move, seemingly unfazed by the torrential rain. It was a woman, pale and drenched, her long dark hair plastered to her face. She was barefoot and wearing a thin, tattered dress, entirely unsuitable for the storm. Against her better judgment, Claire rolled down the passenger side window. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She called out, struggling to be heard over the rain. The woman didn't answer. She just nodded slowly and pointed down the road. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Claire hesitated, every nerve screaming at her to drive away. But she couldn't leave someone out here in this weather. She reached over and unlocked the door. The woman climbed in silently, bringing with her an icy chill that immediately fogged up the windows. She didn't say a word, didn't even acknowledge Claire. She simply sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her presence was suffocating, the air in the car suddenly heavy and cold. "Where are you heading?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. No response. She tried again. "Is there a house nearby? Somewhere I can drop you off?" The woman finally turned her head, her neck twisting at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto Claire. "Keep driving," she whispered, her voice raspy and faint like wind through dead leaves. Claire's grip on the wheel tightened as she obeyed. The rain seemed to grow fiercer, the pounding on the roof almost deafening. The road stretched endlessly before them, flanked by dense, shadowy woods that seemed to press closer with every mile. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Claire kept glancing at the woman out of the corner of her eye, her unease growing with each stolen glance. The passenger didn't move, didn't blink. Water dripped steadily from her soaked dress, pooling on the floor mat, though Claire couldn't hear the sound over the storm. And then the woman spoke again. "Turn left." Claire frowned. There hadn't been a single side road for miles, yet she found herself slowing down. Sure enough, there was a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees, barely visible in the gloom. It hadn't been there a moment ago, she was sure of it. I don't think this is the right way," Claire stammered. "Turn left," the woman repeated, her voice sharper now, more insistent. Against every instinct, Claire complied, the car's tires slipping slightly as she veered onto the muddy track. The woods swallowed them whole, the trees arching overhead to form a tunnel that blocked out what little light the storm allowed. The road became rougher, the car bouncing and jostling with every pothole. Claire opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, but then she saw it, a house at the end of the path, its silhouette barely visible in the rain. It was old, decrepit, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet the woman in the passenger seat leaned forward slightly as if drawn to it. "Stop here," she said. Claire hesitated. "Are you sure? That place doesn't look safe. Stop here." The woman's voice was a command now, and Claire found herself obeying, her foot pressing the brake against her will. The engine idled as they sat in the rain. The woman didn't move, didn't make any effort to get out. Finally, Claire couldn't take it anymore. "Listen, I don't know who you are or what's going on, but The woman turned to face her fully now, and Claire's words died in her throat. Her eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared back at her, black and glistening as if filled with rainwater. A jagged smile spread across her face, impossibly wide, stretching far beyond the limits of human anatomy. "Thank you," the woman rasped, "for bringing me home." And then she dissolved. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, her soaked dress and pale skin melting into a formless mist that filled the car with the stench of decay. Claire screamed, slamming her foot on the gas. The tires spun wildly in the mud before finally catching traction, the car lurching forward and skidding back onto the main road. She didn't stop, didn't look back, not until she was miles away. Even then, she kept the doors locked and the windows rolled up tight, her hands shaking on the wheel. When she reached the nearest town, she stumbled into the gas station, drenched and trembling, and demanded to know about the road she'd taken. The clerk's face paled when she described the dirt path and the house at its end. "That road's been closed for years," he said. "There was a landslide, buried the whole thing. No way you could have driven it. But the house? Burned down decades ago," the clerk interrupted. "Nobody lived there except for some crazy woman. They say she used to wander the road, looking for people to bring back with her." Claire didn't stay to hear the rest. She refueled and drove straight through the night, the rain finally letting up as dawn broke. But she couldn't shake the sound of the woman's voice, nor the terrible smile that would haunt her dreams forever. And every now and then, when she drives alone on a rainy night, she swears she hears a faint whisper over the hum of the engine. "Turn left." The storm rolled in fast that evening, dark clouds swallowing the twilight sky as thunder growled in the distance. Ethan, a seasoned truck driver, was used to driving through all kinds of weather, but something about this particular stretch of highway made him uneasy. It was an old, winding route through a forested valley, rarely used anymore since the new freeway opened. Locals called it Devil's Hollow. Ethan scoffed at the name. It was just a road. Still, as the first raindrops splattered his windshield, he couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that something was wrong. The radio hissed static, and Ethan turned it off with a sigh. The rain quickly escalated from a drizzle to a torrential downpour, hammering against the cab of his truck. Visibility dropped to a few feet, his headlights struggling to pierce the gloom. The road felt narrower than he remembered, the dense trees pressing in on either side like skeletal hands reaching for him. And then he saw her. A figure appeared in the beam of his headlights, a woman standing in the middle of the road, drenched and motionless. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop just feet away from her. Heart pounding, he leaned out of the window. "Ma'am, are you okay? What are you doing out here in this weather?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, her long dark hair hanging like a curtain over her face, her white dress clinging to her frail frame. Her shoulders twitched as if she were sobbing, though Ethan couldn't hear anything over the pounding rain. Cursing under his breath, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The cold rain soaked through his jacket instantly, but he approached her cautiously, the beam of light trembling in his hand. "Hey, do you need help? I can give you a ride to town?" He offered. The woman lifted her head slightly, and Ethan froze. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes, they were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, wide and inhuman. Ethan staggered back, tripping over his own feet. He scrambled to his truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The woman didn't move, didn't come closer. She just stood there, staring, her hollow eyes fixed on him. He floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, and he sped past her, the figure disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. His heart thundered in his chest as he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again. But there was nothing, just rain and shadows. Minutes passed, and Ethan started to convince himself it was some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then the smell hit him. It was faint at first, a sour, acrid stench that made his nose wrinkle. He thought it might be something in the truck's engine, But as the smell grew stronger, he realized it was coming from the cab. He glanced into the passenger seat, and his blood ran cold. Water was pooling on the seat, dripping steadily as if someone were sitting there soaking wet. The smell intensified, a nauseating mix of mildew and rot. His hands tightened on the wheel as panic set in. He kept driving, his eyes darting between the road and the seat. The rain outside grew heavier, the wipers struggling to keep up. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow flickered in the passenger seat. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. No answer. The truck's radio crackled to life suddenly, filling the cab with static. Over the noise, a faint voice emerged, whispering in a language he didn't understand. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Leave me alone," he yelled, swerving slightly as he tried to keep control of the truck. The whispering stopped, but the shadow didn't leave. It seemed to grow, stretching across the cab, filling the space with darkness. Ethan felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, and in the rearview mirror he caught a glimpse of her face, those hollow eyes, that grotesque smile. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. He flung the door open and stumbled out into the rain, gasping for air. When he turned back, the cab was empty. The smell was gone, the seat dry. Everything was normal. But the road wasn't. The highway he'd been driving on was gone. He stood on a dirt path, surrounded by trees so dense they blotted out the sky. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, oppressive. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. He turned in circles, disoriented. His truck was there, but the familiar surroundings of the highway had vanished. He reached for his phone, but it had no signal. The flashlight in his hand flickered and died. Then from the darkness came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from all sides, and her voice, soft, mocking, echoing through the trees. "You shouldn't have stopped." Ethan ran. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. The footsteps grew louder, the laughter more menacing. Branches snagged at his clothes, the ground slick with mud. He stumbled, fell, but kept running, his lungs burning. Finally, he burst into a clearing. There in the center was his truck, its headlights on, illuminating the woman standing directly in front of it. She smiled, that awful, unnatural smile, and raised one hand, pointing at him. The headlights flickered and died, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan was never seen again. Some say his truck was found weeks later, abandoned on the old highway, its cab soaked with water. Others claim to have seen a pale figure standing by the road on rainy nights, her hollow eyes watching, waiting for the next driver, foolish enough to stop. The rain hammered down in icy sheets, drenching the narrow road as Amanda squinted through the windshield, struggling to see the faint yellow lines. Her car's heater whined in protest, barely keeping the chill at bay. She'd taken the wrong turn hours ago, and her phone was useless, its battery long dead. The only light came from her flickering headlights, and the road ahead seemed endless. As the storm grew fiercer, her car's engine began to sputter. Panic clawed at her as the vehicle shuddered violently before coming to a halt. She twisted the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to turn over, emitting only a grinding whine. Amanda groaned, leaning her head on the steering wheel, stranded, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The night closed in around her, the rain muffling everything except the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Grabbing her flashlight, she decided to look for help, hoping there might be a house nearby. She pulled on her raincoat and stepped out into the storm, the wind whipping her hair against her face. Her flashlight's beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a dense forest on either side of the road. The storm seemed to devour sound, leaving an eerie quiet beneath the rain. Amanda trudged forward, her boots squelching in the mud. After what felt like an eternity, she spotted it. A faint light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Relief surged through her. A house! Someone was home. She left the road, pushing her way through the underbrush. The light grew brighter, revealing an old cabin nestled among the trees. Its windows glowed warmly, an inviting beacon in the storm. Amanda knocked on the door, her knuckles cold and trembling. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a cozy interior. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The smell of burning wood filled the air. Amanda stepped inside hesitantly, dripping water onto the wooden floor. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. No answer. The cabin looked lived in but abandoned. A mug of tea sat on the table, steam still rising from it. A rocking chair swayed gently near the fireplace, though no one was there to move it. Amanda's unease grew, but the warmth was irresistible after the biting cold outside. She approached the chair and stopped. Above the fireplace was a large, faded portrait of a family. A stern-looking man, a woman with hollow eyes, and two children who stared blankly at the viewer. The more Amanda looked at it, the more unsettled she felt. Their eyes seemed to follow her, their expressions growing darker the longer she stared. A loud thud from upstairs made her jump. It was followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Amanda froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Hello? Is someone there?" she whispered. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only the sound of the rain pelting the roof. Then the stairs began to creak, one by one, as if someone or something was descending. The rocking chair stopped swaying. Amanda backed toward the door, her heart pounding. "I don't mean any harm. My car broke down and I just..." The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, but no one was there. The air grew colder, the warmth from the fire dissipating as an unnatural chill crept through the cabin. The front door slammed shut behind her, and Amanda spun around, tugging at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Amanda's flashlight flickered, the beam barely piercing the growing darkness. She turned it toward the stairs and screamed. The family from the portrait stood there, their eyes black and empty, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. They moved toward her, their feet not touching the ground, gliding silently like predators closing in on prey. Amanda stumbled back, clawing at the door as the whispers grew louder, filling her head. She felt cold hands grip her shoulders, spinning her around to face the family. Their mouths opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and the cabin's walls seemed to close in, the shadows devouring her. When the storm passed the next morning, Amanda's car was found on the side of the road, its driver's seat empty. Search parties combed the forest, but there was no trace of her. Locals avoided the area, muttering about the cursed cabin that had claimed lives for generations. Some nights, when the rain is heavy and the wind howls through the trees, travelers on the road claim to see a faint light flickering deep in the woods. Those who follow it are never seen again. The storm came without warning, a violent tempest that turned the quiet countryside into a swirling chaos of rain and wind. Mia was driving back from a late shift, the isolation of the empty road soothing at first, but now oppressive under the relentless weather. The wipers thumped rhythmically, but they were no match for the downpour. The trees lining the road swayed violently, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. She almost didn't see it at first. A figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated briefly in the headlights. Startled, Mia hit the brakes, her car skidding slightly on the slick pavement. She peered through the rain-streaked windshield, her heart pounding. It was a man, hunched over and holding his arm as if injured. His clothes were tattered, soaked through, and he wasn't wearing shoes. Against her better judgment, Mia rolled down the window a crack. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't look up, but he nodded slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. Mia hesitated. He seemed wrong. But she couldn't just leave him out here in the storm. With a sigh, she unlocked the passenger door. "Get in," she said, trying to sound firm. The man climbed in without a word, bringing with him an overwhelming stench of damp earth and decay. Mia fought the urge to gag as she glanced at him. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed and downcast. He clutched his arm tightly, his fingers caked with mud. Or was it something darker? "You're hurt," Mia said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you need a hospital?" "No hospital," the man muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "Just drive." Mia's unease deepened, but she nodded and pulled back onto the road. The man didn't speak again, didn't even move. His presence filled the car with an oppressive weight, and Mia found herself gripping the wheel tightly, her eyes flicking nervously to him every few seconds. After several tense minutes, he finally spoke. "Turn here." Mia frowned. They were in the middle of nowhere, the forest pressing in on either side. But she saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the left, almost hidden by the overgrown brush. "I don't think this leads anywhere," she said, her voice shaky. "Turn here." he repeated, more forcefully this time. She swallowed hard and obeyed, the tires crunching on the uneven path. The road was narrow, the trees closing in so tightly that the branches scraped against the car's sides. The storm seemed quieter here, the rain muffled by the dense canopy above. As they drove deeper into the woods, the smell in the car grew worse. It was overpowering now, a nauseating blend of rot and mildew. Mia rolled down her window slightly, gasping for fresh air, but the smell clung to her like a shroud. The man began to hum softly, a low, tuneless drone that sent shivers down her spine. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant, and it made her skin crawl. "Where are we going?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Home," he said simply. Mia's stomach turned. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. "That's it. Get out. I don't care if you're hurt, you need to." She froze. The man was staring at her now, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin that split his face from ear to ear. "You're already here," he whispered. Mia's breath caught as the headlights flickered and died, plunging the car into darkness. The hum grew louder, surrounding her, filling her ears, her head, her entire being. She fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the car grew cold, icy tendrils wrapping around her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. And then she saw them, faces in the trees, pale and ghostly, their hollow eyes staring at her through the rain-specked windows. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. The man's grin stretched wider, his features distorting, melting, until he was no longer a man at all, but something ancient and terrible, his form flickering like a shadow barely tethered to the world. The last thing Mia heard was his voice, echoing in her mind as the darkness consumed her. "Welcome to the forest." When her car was found days later, it was empty, the interior soaked and covered in a fine layer of mud. The locals whispered about the cursed woods, about the lost travelers who were never seen again. And on stormy nights, some claimed to hear a low hum emanating from the trees, growing louder if you dared to stop and listen. The rain fell in a steady, relentless curtain as Jake guided his car down the winding country road. He was tired, his eyes heavy after hours of driving, but he was close to his destination, a secluded bed and breakfast he'd booked for a weekend getaway. The GPS flickered on the dashboard, the signal faltering in the storm, but Jake reassured himself. The B&B owner had said it was easy to find. As the rain intensified, Jake saw a sign illuminated in his headlights. Willowbrook Manor, 2 miles. Relief washed over him. He slowed his car, squinting to make out the narrow driveway leading off the main road. The trees seemed to lean in as he turned, their gnarled branches forming an archway overhead. The driveway was unpaved, muddy from the rain, and the car's tires struggled to grip the earth. Finally, after what felt like forever, he saw the manor. A towering Victorian structure silhouetted against the dark sky, its windows glowing faintly. Jake parked and hurried to the front door, his jacket offering little protection against the downpour. The door opened before he could knock, and a woman in an old-fashioned dress greeted him. She was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, but her smile was warm. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You must be Mr. Carter." Yeah, that's me," Jake said, stepping inside. The warmth of the manor was a welcome contrast to the storm. The interior was exactly what he'd expected. Antique furniture, ornate wallpaper, and a grand staircase leading up to the second floor. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of lavender filled the air. "Your room is ready," the woman continued, gesturing for him to follow her upstairs. "You're our only guest tonight." Jake nodded, his footsteps echoing as they climbed the stairs. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and alive. His room was at the end of the hall, cozy and well-decorated, with a 4-poster bed and a window overlooking the rain-drenched grounds. "Breakfast is at 8, the woman said before retreating, leaving Jake alone. He unpacked quickly and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking him. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, but the manor felt sturdy, unshakable. Jake drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sound of the rain. He woke suddenly in the middle of the night, his heart racing for no apparent reason. The room was pitch dark, the storm still roaring outside. Jake reached for his phone, but it was dead. He'd forgotten to charge it. He fumbled for the lamp on the nightstand, but it wouldn't turn on. A faint sound reached his ears, barely audible over the storm. It was a whisper, distant and indistinct, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Jake froze, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, closer, until he could make out the words, "Leave, now." His breath hitched, and he sat up, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The room was empty, but the whispers continued, circling him, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jake threw on his jacket and opened the door to the hallway. It was dark, save for a faint light at the far end. The whispers followed him as he crept toward the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath his weight. When he reached the bottom floor, he froze. The front door was open, swinging gently in the wind. The rain lashed against the threshold, but what caught his attention was the figure standing just outside. It was the woman who had welcomed him, her dress soaked and clinging to her thin frame. Her head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and her eyes were wide, staring directly at him. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice distorted, layered with a dozen others. "They don't like visitors." Jake backed away, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, angry now, filling the air with unintelligible murmurs. Shadows began to move along the walls, slithering and twisting like living things. The fire in the hearth flared violently, casting grotesque shapes across the room. He turned and ran, his feet slipping on the wet floor. The whispers became screams, the shadows reaching for him, clawing at his arms and legs. He stumbled out the front door and into the storm, the wind and rain battering him as he sprinted toward his car. When he reached it, the tires were sunk in the mud, the vehicle refusing to budge. He turned to look back at the manor, and his stomach dropped. The lights in the windows had gone out, but the figures remained, dozens of them now, staring at him from every pane, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jake didn't stop running. He abandoned the car and tore down the driveway, his lungs burning, the rain blinding him. When he finally reached the main road, he flagged down a passing truck and begged for a ride. The driver listened silently as Jake babbled about the manor. When Jake finally fell quiet, the man spoke, his voice grim. "There's no manor down that road," he said. "Burned down 50 years ago. Killed everyone inside." Jake stared at him, unable to speak. When he turned to look out the truck's window, he saw it one last time in the distance. Willowbrook Manor, standing tall and dark against the storm, its windows glowing faintly. And in one of those windows, the woman watched him leave, her head still tilted, her hollow eyes unblinking. The rain was a deafening roar as Lily navigated the winding mountain road, the darkness pressing in on all sides. She had left the city hours ago, determined to make it to her family's old cabin by nightfall, but the storm had other plans. The headlights barely illuminated the slick asphalt ahead, and the GPS on her phone had long lost its signal. As she rounded a sharp curve, something flashed in her periphery. A figure, a man, standing on the side of the road, drenched and motionless. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She kept driving, her fingers gripping the wheel. She wasn't about to stop for anyone in the middle of nowhere, especially during a storm like this. But the road curved again, and there he was. The same man, standing in the rain, closer this time. His clothes clung to his body, and his face was turned away, obscured by the shadow of his soaked hood. Lily's stomach twisted. "It's impossible," she thought. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her so quickly. She pressed harder on the gas, her car skidding slightly as she tried to outpace the unease crawling up her spine. The rain blurred everything outside, but she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the middle of the road, staring after her. And then she saw him again, directly ahead. Her tires screeched as she slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing before coming to a halt. He was there, standing in the middle of the road, staring at her now. His face was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes glinted like polished glass, reflecting the headlights. "Damn it," Lily muttered under her breath, her pulse hammering. She fumbled for her phone, but the screen was dead, no battery. She locked her doors and revved the engine, preparing to swerve around him. But when she looked back, he was gone. Her breath hitched. She scanned the road frantically, her heart in her throat. The man had vanished, leaving only the rain-soaked asphalt behind. Shaking, Lily pressed on, her car lurching forward. She told herself it was just her imagination, just the storm playing tricks on her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The cabin finally came into view, a welcome sight in the endless dark. It was exactly as she remembered it, rustic and small. with a wraparound porch and a faint light glowing in the front window. She parked her car and bolted for the door, the rain soaking her to the bone. Once inside, she locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old memories, and the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot offered a small measure of comfort. She lit a fire in the stone hearth, hoping to shake the chill that had settled deep into her bones. The warmth spread slowly, and Lily started to relax. She changed into dry clothes, made a cup of tea, and curled up on the couch with a blanket. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the cabin felt safe, until she heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but they grew louder, deliberate, pacing back and forth on the porch. Lily's breath caught and her stomach churned. She crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty, the rain cascading off the eaves. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin now, crunching on the gravel path. Lily grabbed a fireplace poker, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only the sound of the rain, then a knock, a single sharp rap on the front door. Lily's heart hammered in her chest. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the door. The knock came again, louder this time. And then the voice, "Let me in." It was deep, distorted, and carried a strange echo as if the speaker were underwater. Lily's grip tightened on the poker as she shook her head. "Go away, I'm calling the police." The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "There's no one to call, Lily. You're all alone out here." Her blood ran cold. How did they know her name? The knock became pounding, the door shaking under the force. Lily retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. And then, from the window behind her, the same voice whispered, "I told you. Let me in." Lily spun around, but the window was empty, just rain streaking down the glass. She felt the room grow colder, the air thick and heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around her. The voice came again, this time right behind her. "You brought me here, Lily. Don't you remember?" She turned, swinging the poker wildly, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself with a hiss, plunging the cabin into blackness. The last thing Lily saw was her own reflection in the window, but her reflection didn't match her movements. It smiled, its glassy eyes glinting in the dark, and then it stepped away, leaving her alone with the storm and the shadows closing in. Lily's car was discovered days later, abandoned on the road. The cabin was empty, untouched, as if no one had been there at all. Locals whispered about the storm that night, about the man people had seen standing in the road before vanishing into the rain. They said he was a harbinger, a lost soul who sought company in his eternal misery. And those who saw him were never truly alone again. The rain battered the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists as Claire gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The old highway was deserted, the only light coming from her flickering headlights. She had been driving for hours, fleeing the suffocating weight of the city after a bitter argument with her boyfriend. The storm had come out of nowhere, and her phone had no signal to guide her back to familiar roads. Ahead, a green road sign loomed through the sheets of rain. Eldridge, 5 miles. It wasn't her intended destination, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. She turned off the main highway onto a narrower, darker road. Trees lined both sides, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. The small town of Eldridge appeared as a cluster of dimly lit buildings, the streets eerily empty. A single gas station stood at the town's edge, its neon sign flickering weakly. Claire pulled in, relieved to see a light on in the small convenience store attached to the pumps. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and damp wood. A lone cashier sat behind the counter, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and a hollow stare. He didn't greet her, just watched silently as she browsed the aisles. Claire grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. "Rough night," she said, trying to break the awkward silence. The man didn't respond at first. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he said, "You shouldn't be here." Claire blinked. "Excuse me?" "Storm nights bring them out," he muttered, his gaze darting to the window. "Best you leave before it's too late." Claire laughed nervously, assuming he was just some eccentric local. "Thanks for the advice," she said, handing over a few bills. She left the gas station feeling uneasy, but brushed it off. Back in her car, she debated whether to stay in Eldridge for the night or keep driving. The storm made the decision for her when the engine sputtered and died, refusing to start again. "Great," Claire muttered, slumping back in her seat. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the rain, hoping to find someone who could help. The streets were eerily silent, the buildings dark and lifeless. Water pooled in the cracked pavement, reflecting the faint glow of her flashlight. She spotted a diner down the street, its neon sign blinking weakly. It was her best bet. Inside, the diner was empty. The chairs were stacked on the tables, and the counter was dusty, as if no one had been there in years. Yet, a pot of coffee sat on the warmer, steam rising from the spout. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice echoing. "Anyone here?" No answer. She turned to leave, but something on the counter caught her eye. A newspaper, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Storm claims entire town, Eldridge wiped off the map." Claire's stomach twisted. The date on the paper was from 20 years ago. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as the diner's door slammed shut behind her. The air grew cold, and the rain outside seemed to quiet, replaced by a low, rumbling sound. The flashlight's beam caught movement in the corner of the diner. A figure stood there, half shrouded in shadow. Its form was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Who's there?" Claire stammered, backing toward the door. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The shadows seemed to cling to it, twisting and writhing. As it emerged into the dim light, Claire's blood ran cold. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a hollow void, a swirling blackness that seemed to pull at her, drawing her toward it. She screamed and bolted out of the diner, her feet splashing through puddles as she ran blindly down the street. The rain was deafening now, the town dissolving into a maze of shifting shadows. She tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering away and extinguishing. In the darkness, she heard whispers, faint at first, then louder, surrounding her. They weren't words, but a cacophony of voices, overlapping and dissonant. She scrambled to her feet, spinning wildly, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in. A hand, cold and skeletal, gripped her arm. She turned to see the void-faced figure towering over her, its head tilting as if studying her. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo as the darkness consumed her. When the storm cleared the next morning, Eldridge was as it always was, an abandoned ghost town. Travelers who passed through swore they saw lights in the diner or movement in the windows of the gas station, but no one ever stayed long enough to investigate. Claire's car was found by a passing motorist, its doors locked and engine cold. Inside was her flashlight and a single scrap of paper, its ink smeared but legible. "They're still here." The storm rolled in with a ferocity no weather report had predicted, turning the quiet countryside into a churning sea of rain and wind. James and Aaron, a young couple on their way to a weekend getaway, found themselves hopelessly lost on a back road. Their GPS had gone haywire, showing a blank screen, and there wasn't a single light in sight except for the occasional flicker of lightning. "This is ridiculous," Aaron muttered, hugging herself against the chill. "We should have stayed on the highway." I know, James replied, squinting through the windshield. The wipers thrashed wildly, but the rain was relentless. "There's got to be something up ahead. A gas station, a house, anything." The narrow road seemed endless, hemmed in by thick trees that swayed violently in the storm. Just as Aaron was about to suggest turning back, the car's headlights caught a sign on the side of the road. "Blackwood Manor, lodging 1 mile. Looks like we've got a place to stop," James said, relieved. He turned down the unmarked dirt path indicated by the sign, the tires crunching on the uneven terrain. The road led them deeper into the woods, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around the car. When the manor came into view, it was like something out of a Gothic novel. The sprawling structure was old, its once grand exterior weathered and crumbling. The windows glowed faintly, promising shelter from the storm. "Looks cozy," Aaron said, her voice laced with sarcasm. James chuckled nervously. "It's just for one night." The couple parked and made a dash for the front door. The heavy knocker echoed through the house when James struck it. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a hunched posture and piercing eyes. "Travelers," he said, his voice gravely. "You're just in time. Storm's bad tonight." "Yeah, we got lost," James said. "Is it okay if we stay here for the night?" The man nodded slowly. "We've got rooms. Follow me." The interior of the manor was just as eerie as the outside, dimly lit with heavy drapes and creaking floorboards. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The old man led them up a grand staircase to a small but clean room. "Don't wander," he said, his tone a warning. "Stay in your room until morning." Before James or Aaron could ask what he meant, the man shuffled away, his footsteps fading down the hall. "That wasn't creepy at all," Aaron whispered. James shrugged. "It's an old place. He's probably just eccentric." The couple settled in, grateful for the warmth and shelter. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the windows. Despite the manor's unsettling atmosphere, exhaustion soon overtook them, and they drifted off to sleep. James woke to a faint sound in the middle of the night. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. He sat up, straining to hear over the storm. The sound was coming from the hallway. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Aaron, but she was still asleep. Curiosity got the better of him. He crept to the door and opened it just a crack. The hallway was empty, bathed in flickering candlelight from sconces mounted on the walls. The tapping continued, louder now, coming from the far end of the hall. "Hello," James called out, his voice low. No response. Against his better judgment, he stepped into the hallway, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. The sound drew him to a door at the very end. It was slightly ajar, the tapping emanating from within. James pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, but a single window allowed a sliver of moonlight to filter in. His breath caught when he saw it. A woman standing with her back to him, her long, dark hair cascading over a tattered white dress. She was tapping her fingers against the window pane, staring out into the storm. Ma'am? Are you okay?" James asked, his voice trembling. The woman froze, her hand still pressed against the glass. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes black pits that seemed to pull in all light. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. "Why did you come here?" she whispered, her voice a hiss. James stumbled back, his heart pounding. The woman moved toward him, her steps unnaturally fluid, as if her feet didn't quite touch the ground. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. The hallway was different now, warped and endless, with doors lining both sides. The whispers started then, a chorus of voices calling his name, growing louder and more insistent. James ran, but no matter how far he went, the hallway stretched on. The shadows at the edges seemed to move, reaching for him with spindly fingers. He tried door after door, but each one opened to the same room with the same window, and the same woman staring out into the storm. Aaron woke to find James gone. The bed beside her was cold, and the storm outside had quieted to a drizzle. Panic set in as she searched the room, then the hallway. She called his name, but there was no response. Downstairs, the old man was sitting in the parlor, a faint smirk on his lips. "Where is he?" Aaron demanded. The man tilted his head, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "Some roads shouldn't be traveled, some doors shouldn't be opened." Aaron's stomach churned. She turned and ran for the front door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. The storm had stopped, and the morning sun cast an eerie glow on the overgrown driveway. James's car was gone. The manor loomed behind her, silent and still, its windows dark. She called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of Blackwood Manor. Only a crumbling foundation overgrown with weeds. The officers found no evidence that James had ever been there. But Aaron knew. Every night as she lay in bed, she heard the tapping on her window, and in the darkness she could still see the woman's grin.